complete Histories. Not gonna lie, this is like my third time trying to record this on my computer. Just, it's getting frustrated with me, and I'm getting frustrated with it, but that's okay. We're gonna make it through. Today's video is brought to you by the idea from Miss Haley in my 7th period class. Shout out to Miss Haley for the great idea. And you asked for something about the Middle Ages, and I had to kind of think about that because that might refer to a few different things, and you might have heard these names kind of thrown around. Is it the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, the medieval period? Well, here's the thing. All of these words kind of refer to the same period of time. And just to kind of keep things straight today, we're going to use the medieval period. And when we talk about that, we're looking at a period between 500 and 1500 AD. So we've got a stretch of about 1,000 years, a millennium. We remember that word from the beginning of the year. Remember our millennium. So parents, if you kids came home doing that at the beginning of the year, it wasn't TikTok, it was me. Sorry, not sorry. They should remember how many years are in a millennium. 10 times 10 times 10. Anyways, our medieval period starts right at the fall of one of the greatest empires that we haven't studied yet. We're going to study it soon, our Roman Empire. I want you to look how big this empire is. Now, we're going to see when we talk about Rome that they were able to hold on to power on 1, 2, 3 continents for several hundred years, but eventually they collapse. And there's a lot of different reasons why they collapsed. Some people say, oh, they were invaded, and that's one part of it, but there's a lot of other parts as well that we will talk about when we get to those videos. So when we look at this period of time, there's a lot happening in the world in this 1,000 years, in this millennium. We're going to be specifically looking at Europe, though. There's a lot going on pretty much everywhere else as well, in Asia and Africa and the Middle East, but we're going to specifically focus on Europe. And we're not going to have our little timeline buddy today. Sorry, buddy, sad face. Because whether you were at AD 700 or AD 1300, there's going to be some similar things that are going to apply for lifestyle and some of the things that we're going to talk about today. And at the end of the video, I've linked some really great, funny videos that I like to watch about the medieval period called Medieval Lives. And it kind of breaks down even a little bit more all the different facets of what it would be like to be a king in medieval times, or a woman, or a knight. Just things we don't necessarily have time for in our short video today. So let's start off like we always do. We have our geography and our time period. Let's start off by looking at our social hierarchy. So we're going to start with the king at the top, like we always do. All right, we've got a little pyramid. We're familiar with this little pyramid. Here's our king. Hi, King Bob. You've got your little crown. Aren't you happy? Now, we know kings do not just get elected. The people don't choose the king. And as we've seen in other cultures, it's going to be hereditary, meaning the king is going to pass down his crown to usually his firstborn son. And if he doesn't have any sons, well, he's going to keep trying to have kids until he can have a son. Or it might go to a nephew or his daughter's husband. But we're going to try to keep it in the family line here. Right below the king are the nobles and members of the Christian Catholic Church. We talked a little bit about that church yesterday when we were talking about Ireland. So here's our nobles. Nobles are people with lots of money. These are relatives usually of the king, maybe friends, people that have a lot of wealth and are able to support him. And then the church over here, remember that we're going to see that the Christian church basically becomes the thing that gives the king the power and says, hey, king, yes, our God has chosen you to rule, and so you have your power because we say you do, and our God says you do. So we're going to see those members of the church becoming very, very important. Right below them are somebody you might have heard about, the knights. This is kind of like the military class. So these are soldiers, basically, and they owe allegiance to the people above them, but they also protect the people below them. We're going to talk in just a minute about how each of these layers kind of interacts. And then down below we have our peasants. Sometimes these are called serfs. I'm going to write that over here, serf, not surf like you go to the beach and surf, S-E-R-F. And these are our farmers, okay? And also just kind of our everyday tradesmen, our butchers and our blacksmiths and all of that kind of fall into this peasant level. Now, the peasants are going to be here at the bottom. The king is going to give land to the nobles in the church. The king has all the power. He is head dude in charge. So he technically owns his entire country. Okay, so he's going to be the one who says, okay, Duke so and so, you're going to get these 1,000 acres of land. The nobles in church break that land up smaller and give it to their knights and their lords and ladies to kind of rule over. And then the peasants get protection from the knights while they work the land because that's their job. They are kind of almost servants, really. They don't own any of the land that they work on. So in exchange for being protected from invading knights and armies and all that, the peasants are going to give food and do labor for the people above them. And then the knights are going to turn around, and if the nobles or the church needs somebody to fight for them, the knights are going to be able to be called on. And then the nobles in church gives money and protection to the king. So the idea is that everyone on here gives something to the level above and does something for the level below. It's one big cycle, okay? Now, of course, life for if you're up at the top is going to be very different than if you're at the bottom. So let's take a minute to look at what life would be like for peasants versus somebody, say, in the knights or nobles class. Or a peasant, most of life during the medieval times is going to revolve around the manor house and all the land around it. So you might have seen pictures of big stone castles, and that was the case especially in the later period of the medieval era. But oftentimes these manor houses would be made out of wood or whatever the resources were around, sometimes stone, sometimes brick. And sometimes they were just kind of bigger houses, sometimes they were true castles. But they were always protected with a wall, and they were on whatever was the highest area around, because if there were attacking invaders, everybody who lived down here in the village would go boop, 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 up. And this is the protection that the lords were able to give the serfs or the regular people. Down here we have that church, and that church is going to play a huge role in the life of everyday people. And we've got several different fields. Now remember, all these fields are owned by the lord of the manor here, okay? So the serfs don't own these. And so the serfs are down here, and they would work these different fields, and they would rotate the crops in and out. Now, depending on who you were, your clothes you wore would be very simple if you were a serf family. So here's serf mom, serf dad, and little serf kid carrying that big old bucket of water. They were farmers. They lived kind of a very simple, basic life. They lived in one of these little houses down here. And most of their life was spent working in the fields or doing their trades or their crafts for their lord of the manor. Here is that family that lives up in the manor house. Again, mom, dad, and son. Um, and your life would be pretty dependent on where you were in that kind of that social hierarchy. Now, noble boys and girls got education from their parents. Their parents might have hired tutors, but those serfs, they were just kind of, most of them didn't know how to read. Most of them didn't need to know how to read. They farmed their entire life. Now, if you're thinking, well, man, I would really want to be over on this side, keep in mind that the noble families often married off their children at a real young age, like 12 to 14 young. So I know some of my sixth graders are 12 at this time of the year, so hope you're ready for wedding bells. Serfs actually ended up getting married a little bit later usually. But those lords of the manor like to marry their kids off pretty early to cement alliances and kind of make sure that you had, your connections in order for the lord in the next town over. Now, most people went to church. That's why you see, other than the manor house, the church is one of the bigger buildings in town. It was just considered what you did. There was no real freedom of choice. The church worked kind of hand in hand with the king, so you were expected to go to church. And sometimes even once a day during holiday season, sometimes even more. Now, let's talk about food a little bit. if you're a common person, you had bread, of course, but it was pretty coarse. And then this delicious concoction. This is called pottage. And it's basically just a stew of whatever you could get your hands on. So this particular one has some cabbage and some grain and little bits of bacon and just things like that. It's okay. You eat what you can. If you were a serf, you mostly did not eat meat, even though there would have been farm animals around. Those farm animals were way too valuable for providing eggs, for providing milk, for providing other things that you might not even get to keep for yourself. You might have to give to the lord of the manor. Now, if cabbage soup doesn't sound that appealing to you, you might enjoy the meals that our lords and ladies had a little bit more. So bread, but not just rough, coarse brown bread, beautiful white bread. So all of the best flour in the village would be reserved for your family. You would get more meat here, okay? Bird, poultry, beef, all of that. And also, these were the people who had spices. Now, during the Middle Ages, people in Europe loved spice for a couple of reasons. One, their new exciting flavors coming all the way from places like India and China on that Silk Road that we've talked about, but also they helped preserve meat for a lot longer. Remember, no refrigeration. And a lot of Europe was relatively warm in the summer, so meat went bad very quickly. So some spices help preserve. But also kind of mask the taste when things aren't as delicious and fresh. If all you can taste is pepper, you can't taste the rotten meat. And I don't know, some of the other things that lords and ladies, noble people in the Middle Ages would have eaten, maybe I would want to put a whole bunch of spices on it too. For example, swans were very, very popular. And all sorts of seafood, fish, we eat fish too. I've never eaten a creature that looks like this in my life, have you? This is a lamprey. It looks like something out of a nightmare. Let me just zoom that in for you a little bit. Nightmare food. But super popular during our medieval times. If you were wealthy enough to get these caught from the oceans or from the rivers, you would bake these into pies, all sorts of things. I don't know. This looks like something in my worst nightmare that would eat me. I don't think I would want to try to eat it. I don't know about you, but that's terrifying to me. Now, if you were in a noble or royal family during the Middle Ages, there was a pretty strict line of how things went. So if you were the father, you would pass down your land and your money to your eldest son. Well, what happened to your daughters? Hopefully, you were able to marry them off to good matches. Or what happened to your other sons that, well, you can't pass down everything to them. You don't want to split it up. Remember, never trust your sons with your empire. You never want to split up your empires. So if you were the second or third son, you had a couple choices. You might go be a knight, and we'll talk about that. So our modern day equivalent would be joining the military. Or your other option would be to join the church and become possibly a monk or a priest. Remember, the church was a big deal. It wasn't just something people went to once in a while. This was something that controlled the king on down. So many people became either monks or nuns if they couldn't marry, or if they were like the second or third sons and really didn't have any use on their father's property, especially if you were of the wealthy class. So a monastery is a place where religious folks, monks or nuns, come and they dedicate their life to God and to studying and to prayer and to the focusing of the mind on religious matters. What this meant is that they would have almost like a manor house of their own. And all of these monks would come together, and there were thousands of these all over Europe. And they would have places for sleeping, they would have places for going to church, for eating, and for doing all sorts of work. Now, some monks even took vows of silence or only ate certain things. Monks are often depicted in these very kind of plain robes with these haircuts that kind of definitely set them apart. You've got a ring around and then a bald top, and they shave them like that. So These monks were some of the only people, you'll notice he has something kind of unique, a book. They were some of the only people to keep literacy alive. After the fall of the Roman Empire, a lot of people over several generations were so focused on just surviving and making sure their families had enough food that they didn't have time for formal education. But this is a time where they really didn't need to be out working in the fields. The monks didn't. They kind of collected money from local farmers and local lords to be supported. And they spent a lot of time studying, reading, and copying books. Now, there was no Xerox machine, no printers in, let's say, AD 1200. So any book in Europe that was created had to be hand drawn and handwritten and hand copied. So we see these things called scriptoriums where the monks, and you can kind of see, there's one right there, would sit down for hours and hours and try to have as much daylight as possible copying works of literature, usually the Bible, sometimes things that the king had said, or other books from the ancient times like the Greek and Roman historians, and kind of preserving that knowledge. But it was exhausting and it was very tedious. Imagine just copying for hours on end out of your textbook. That would drive me crazy. So we get these beautiful books. If you've ever doodled in the margins of your notes, you understand this thinking. These are called illuminated manuscripts, and they're absolutely gorgeous. And a lot of them are just the monks getting bored while they're copying and just trying to make it look prettier than usual. And some of these pictures are funny. I'll let you search them up yourself, but there's people, doing crazy acrobatics and animals running races and all sorts of illustrations in the margins of these books. But for a long time, these religious communities were the only places where these books were kept. It's not till we start to see the printing press involved, where you can make lots of copies of something much more quickly, in the 1500s or late 1400s, early 1500s, where the average everyday person would have enough money to be able to buy a book and read it. Now, if you were that second or third son and you didn't want to go into monastic life, you didn't want to be a monk, then you had another option open to you. You could be a knight, and a knight was a soldier. And soldiers were in high demand because the kings of all of the various kingdoms in medieval Europe were constantly fighting. And the lords were constantly fighting over boundaries of land, over who said what. And so if you were a soldier, you had a pretty lucrative job. This is a way that you could, if you were really brave in battle, maybe be awarded land, money, things that you wouldn't get if you were a second or third son from your family. So this was a great kind of way for a young man to make his way in the world. Now, it required a lot of training. Take a look at the gear that these knights are wearing. So you've got heavy metal armor, you've got a helmet, you're covered from head to toe, it's hot, you've got a gigantic sword. So modern day soldiers have to train for months to be able to carry all their gear and their body armor and all of that. This would be nothing different. So unless you were actively fighting, most of your days would be spent doing physical training, battle training, all of that. Um, And like I said, for the most part, most knights during the medieval period kind of fought amongst each other, king against king, group against group. But we do see most knights in Europe uniting for at least a couple hundred years during a period of time in the middle or in the medieval era called the Crusades. Now, notice here's Jerusalem. Now, we've talked about this holy city before. While the Romans were in control, the Romans had this whole area, the purple, the yellow, the red, the green, all locked down. But we know that the city of Jerusalem is a very holy, important city to three major world religions, the Christians, the Jewish, and Muslims. So three major world religions. After Rome kind of lost control of this area, Muslim kings came and kind of took this area and took control of it, and all of the yellow you see are Muslim lands, starting at about 1096. And so they kind of spread out and took back some of the land that the Romans had taken while Europe was focused on rebuilding itself. But in the late 1000s, the Christian church said, hey, that city of Jerusalem, maybe we want it back. And that triggered 200 years of war, which is just a long time. There's several different wars, First, Second, Third, and Fourth Crusades that happened. And the red areas are areas where crusaders, people, these knights who kind of took on these crusades, set up kingdoms after victories. And so this land ended up being battling back and forth for literally several centuries. So if you were a knight, you definitely had some good job security there. Now, after the Crusades were over, you still had all these people who were trained as knights, and you wanted them around as soldiers, but you wanted to keep them busy because then you don't want them fighting themselves or each other or starting problems. So we start to see jousting. Now, you might be familiar with jousting. You might have seen it if you've gone to medieval times. This was kind of taking those skills and using them as a form of entertainment, kind of like gladiator fights in ancient Rome or modern sports today, like football. So knights would kind of come together and use these skills that they would normally use on the battlefield in kind of a competition. And so was jousting like this, there was sword fights, there was wrestling, and it was all kind of showing off and in good humor. But just like sports today, it could certainly be very, very dangerous. Now, we have so much more we could cover in our medieval lives series, but I do want to keep this relatively short and to the point. This one's already longer than yesterday's. So I've got a couple videos linked here. Terry Jones, Medieval Lives. I would love for you to watch them, and hopefully I can go back and trim this down a little bit. Yikes. All right, guys, I'll see you soon. Talk to you later. Bye.